The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone to today's webinar on Reentry Services 101, what homeless service providers need to know. So with all the barriers to housing that people with criminal records face, the issue of housing is very important, and particularly for efforts to end homelessness. Currently, there's a lot of bipartisan support for criminal justice reform at the federal level, and Congress is debating this week whether it will take up this issue this year. And we are working hard as part of a coalition on reentry and housing to make sure that housing is a part of this conversation. If criminal justice reform is going to be successful, it needs to address the housing needs of people coming out of the corrections system. So the purpose of this webinar is to provide homeless service providers with some basic information on reentry and corrections to help you work effectively with these systems in your community. And a first good step to any partnership is understanding how their system is structured and what they care about. To quickly go over today's agenda, my name is Jamie Day, and I am the Policy Director for Individual Homeless Adults here at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and we're very excited to host today's webinar. I am joined by Mary Owens from the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, who will talk about the federal efforts on reentry, Madeline Naley from the Council of State Governments, who will talk about the collateral consequences for people with criminal records or who are leaving correctional institutions. Also Alex McLaren from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, who will talk about how the criminal justice system is organized. Marcus DeWall and Craig Emons from the Alameda County Probation Department, who will talk about parole and probation. And finally, Wendy Jackson from the East Oakland Community Project, who will talk about their housing program that is working with people on parole and probation. So we have a lot of great speakers and content to cover, but we will also try to save some time at the end for questions. And I also want to thank Maureen Ritchie with the Council of State Governments Justice Center for helping us put together this webinar. So before we get started, I want to remind everyone that all of the lines will be muted during the webinar, but if you have questions at any point, you can send them to us through the webinar software. Please type them into the chat box labeled questions on your webinar control panel. For those questions that we do not get to today, we will follow up after the webinar. And also, please note that a recording of this webinar will be posted on the Alliance's website, as well as our coalition's website, which I will talk about in a moment. So today's webinar comes from planning efforts by a national coalition on reentry and housing that formed last November that the National Alliance to End Homelessness is part of. And the Reentry and Housing Coalition is a broad coalition of national and some local advocates promoting safe, stable, and accessible housing for people who have been involved in the criminal or juvenile justice systems. And one of the coalition's goals is to connect housing providers with reentry providers and local criminal justice systems in order to foster lasting partnerships for the benefit of those they serve. And as part of this effort, the coalition held a webinar in June directed towards reentry providers that was a 101 for them on homeless services. And this was hosted by the Council of State Governments, and over 1,000 people signed up for that webinar. The majority of the participants or attendees were Second Chance Act grantees. And the Second Chance Act is a federal program that provides funding for a variety of reentry services throughout the country. And the Council of State Governments has a website with a description of these programs and a map where you can identify the grantees near you. And you can see the website there. As part of that webinar that we provided in June, we described how the continuums of care were organized and how reentry providers could get in touch with homeless service providers like you. And we said you were busy with your COC grant application, but to reach out anyway. And there were a lot of questions from reentry providers on that webinar about when people were eligible for housing programs. And specifically, they wanted to know what their options were if someone had been in an institution for longer than 90 days, which meant that they were no longer eligible for some housing programs. And while it's important that homeless service systems, that the homeless system is not responsible for the housing needs of everyone coming out of corrections, there may also be many people at risk of homelessness, and so it's important that reentry and homeless service systems form effective partnerships. And this could also mean that reentry providers should look into increasing the resources that they have for housing. And in response to these questions from that last webinar, many of us have been working to develop a resource that outlines when people coming out of corrections are eligible for a variety of housing programs. So you can expect to see that resource come out soon. And also a link to the June webinar, along with several other resources on the intersection of reentry and housing, are located on the Coalition's new website, which is reentryandhousing.org. So we encourage you to check that out. So with that, I will turn the time over to Mary Owens.
Thank you, Jamie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here on behalf of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. Today I'm going to take a few minutes to provide some framing from the federal perspective, focusing on our efforts to help people returning from incarceration access stable housing in order to successfully reenter our neighborhoods and our communities. So let's get started by first discussing what homelessness looks like in the United States. In HUD's annual homeless assessment report, it was estimated that approximately 565,000 people were identified as experiencing homelessness on a given night in January 15. 31% were found in unsheltered locations, and nearly a quarter were children under the age of 18. And this is partially attributed to housing affordability in the United States, really the lack of affordability. In order for someone in the U.S. to afford a two-bedroom apartment, they must make approximately $39,000 a year, and this is about $18.92 an hour. And the average renter in the U.S. has a full-time job with an hourly wage of $14.65. So this means that a family with one full-time worker earning minimum wage cannot afford local fair market rent for a two-bedroom apartment, and this is especially true in high-cost markets like San Francisco and DC and New York, just to name a few. Next slide, please. The federal government is responding to the challenges of homelessness, and leading the efforts is the United States Council on Homelessness. We are charged with leading the federal response to prevent and end homelessness, and our work is guided by Opening Doors, which you can see here, the Federal Strategic Plan to Prevent and End Homelessness, which was launched in 2010. The plan outlines the actions to achieve 4 bold and measurable goals: preventing and ending veteran homelessness in 2015, finishing the job of chronic homelessness in 2017, preventing and ending homelessness among families, children, and youth in 2020, and then setting a path for all types of homelessness. And the results are clear. Our implementation of Opening Doors is working. According to the 2015 point-in-time count, the total number of people experiencing homelessness at a given point in time has been reduced by 11% since 2010, the year the plan was released, and unsheltered homelessness has been released by almost 26% over the same time frame. The data shows that veteran homelessness has been reduced by 36%, chronic homelessness by 22%, and the number of families with children experiencing homelessness has been reduced by 19%. And while there has been significant progress, there's clearly more work to be done across many federal agencies to achieve even greater reductions in homelessness. And despite our progress in reducing homelessness, criminal justice involvement among people experiencing homelessness remains a huge problem. There is a significant overlap among people with criminal justice involvement and people experiencing homelessness. And homelessness and criminal justice involvement is bidirectional, and that means that homelessness increases the risk of criminal justice involvement, and criminal justice involvement increases the risk of homelessness. Estimates project that 15% of people experiencing homelessness have a history of incarceration, and as many as 48,000 people who enter homelessness, as many as 48,000 people, or 5% of all people who have entered homeless shelters in 2013, have come directly from jails or prisons. And this risk is significantly higher among people with serious mental illness and substance use disorders. Homelessness is especially high among people being released from prison, and this can be attributed to the fact that people leaving jails face housing and employment challenges due to their criminal history. Unfortunately, reentry programs provided by the federal government fall short of meeting housing needs for those reentering. Resources remain a challenge as all forms of federal housing assistance are insufficient to meet the need. And on our next slide, we show, this is our typology slide, which shows the relationship between criminal justice involvement and housing and service needs. And as you can see, people with higher housing needs, those with chronic conditions or those who more frequently engage with corrections, need housing that is more permanent in nature and tied to health and service supports. And people with low housing needs need lesser housing interventions like rapid rehousing or family unification. And those in the middle with medium housing and service needs benefit from a myriad of interventions, including access to affordable housing, rapid rehousing, and transitional housing. So now that we've examined the problems underlying reentry and homelessness, we can turn to solutions and ways to address criminal justice involvement and homelessness at the federal level. Opening Doors advances health and housing stability for people experiencing homelessness who have frequent contact with criminal justice as one of its primary objectives. Opening Doors in order to ensure successful community reintegration for people returning from incarceration, we have adopted a series of strategies including discharge planning from reentry in jails, encouraging housing strategies as part of state and community efforts to improve reentry, encouraging states to identify high-need homeless subpopulations through data matching with HMIS, and encouraging constructive approaches to unsheltered homelessness and incentives to urge cities to adopt these practices. Reducing homelessness among people returning from prison requires leadership at the federal level, particularly given many of the problems stem from unanticipated consequences of state and local policies. U.S.C. participates in the Federal Reentry Council, which is led by the Department of Justice and convenes 20 agencies to coordinate federal efforts to reduce recidivism, assist those returning from prison become productive citizens, and save tax dollars by lowering the cost of incarceration. In August 2016, the Reentry Council released a report providing a review of the Council's accomplishments to date and a strategic roadmap for the future. This report includes a robust inventory of progress made by federal agencies to remove barriers to housing for individuals with criminal justice backgrounds, including policy clarifications illustrating misconceptions around HUD rules governing access to public housing for people with criminal records, guidance regarding the use of arrest records in determining who can live in HUD-assisted housing, as well as fair housing guidance that explains when barriers to housing for those with criminal records may violate the anti-discrimination provision of the Fair Housing Act. The report is also forward-looking and discusses future strategies to improve housing and stability for reentering individuals in the future. The Reentry Council is committed to ensuring that all individuals have a safe and stable place to call home and will work with PHAs and other housing providers to increase their understanding of our new guidance and provide training to help housing providers implement fair housing policies. USICH has also released guidance for corrections agencies, reentry service providers, state and local governments, and community partners. This resource, connecting people returning from incarceration with housing and homeless assistance, suggests a range of housing programs that people returning from incarceration might be eligible to receive based on their need, and provides tips on how to connect people exiting the justice system connect to housing. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. If you have questions on the work USICH is doing, or anything that our federal partners are undertaking to reduce homelessness and recidivism, please contact me. And my email address is mary.owens@usich.gov. Thank you. And I'll turn it back to Jamie.
Thanks, Mary. Now we're going to turn the presentation over to Madeline.
Thanks so much, Jamie. This is Madeline Naley. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. The CSG Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that serves policymakers at local, state, and federal levels from all branches of government. We provide practical, nonpartisan advice informed by the best available evidence on criminal justice topics. I really focus on criminal records and employment, but I was asked to speak today on some of the often conflicting needs that someone leaving jail or prison might have. I'm just going to use incarceration to refer to both. Jamie, if we can move forward. So when someone gets out of jail or prison, they have a lot of needs. They might need food, housing, medications. They have potentially mental health care needs, medical health care needs. They're going to need transportation to get all of these things. They need to potentially restart benefits to pay for these needs, for which they're going to need identification. While doing all of this, they're probably worried about reunifying with their family, particularly for primary caregivers coming out. They're going to need to start reporting to their probation or parole officer almost immediately, which might require substance abuse treatment to fulfill the needs of their probation or parole, as well as employment. So these needs don't come in a line. This isn't something that someone can take care of one at a time. All of these are pressing, and all of these need to be filled almost immediately. And as you can see, some of them are conflicting. You might need to restart your benefits, but you can't do that without identification. And as we move to the next slide, we're going to learn more about these different needs. So most people do not leave incarceration prepared or able to meet their needs. We were talking about identification. So it's frequently required to access social services, housing, apply for employment, and for a lot of other things. But most people find themselves without state identification after incarceration. So not only are you coming out without ID, you're coming out without the documents you need to get that ID, which means that you can't start fulfilling some of those other very basic needs that we just identified. Folks need housing. We know that about 10% of people exit incarceration directly into homelessness. And this doesn't conflict with some of the statistics we just heard, because we're talking about people being released from the cell to the street. And oftentimes some people might have a place to go immediately upon release, but lose that when they aren't able to meet some of those other needs. They're not able to find employment, so they can't pay for their place to stay, or they've been staying with someone who's in public housing and is worried about losing their right to housing because they have someone who shouldn't be there on their couch. So a lot of folks who don't exit directly to the streets might end up there later. And in California, one study found that 10% of parolees were homeless, with much higher rates in the major cities such as LA and San Francisco. Healthcare. People in jails and prisons suffer disproportionately high rates of chronic and contagious illnesses. They're 3 times as likely to have a major mental illness, and yet they're leaving jail and prison uninsured and unprepared to deal with those chronic illnesses. On top of that, we've got folks who are coming out, and yes, you need housing, yes, you need food, yes, you need to take care of yourself, but most importantly, what you want to do is get back in touch with your kids. 54% of prisoners are parents with minor children. Those are kids under age 18. meaning that 2.7 million children in the United States have a parent in jail or prison. A lot of prison populations have been stabilizing or even declining in general. However, the population of women inside continues to increase. So we're seeing more mothers getting locked up, and quite honestly, the first step you take when you leave that cell is trying to get back to your kids. So all of these other needs, they seem primary to us, but quite honestly, they're secondary to a mother who just wants to get her kids back. Now, to do any of these things, you've got to get around. I live in New York. Public transit's pretty readily available. I can get anywhere I need to go. But if you're being released to a rural area, or that's where your support network is, you're quite likely not going to have access to public transit. If you do have access to public transit, or public transit's available, you might not be able to access it because you don't have money to do so. So a lot of these needs can't be met simply because people cannot get to them, including being able to report to your parole or probation officer. So the lack of transportation interferes with the ability to report. Conflicting needs interferes with it. You might be told that the first thing you have to do is go report, but again, if you're a mother being released, the first thing you're going to do is try to start the reunification process if you're a parent. So on top of that, the reporting requirements for probation or parole may actually prevent some of the other things you need to do. So if you need to check in physically daily with your PO officer, that's really hard to hold down a job while you're doing that. Or to be able to complete treatment that you might need to complete as part of your probation or parole sentence. Then we have employment. People with criminal records struggle to find and maintain employment for a variety of reasons, not simply the criminal record, but we know that folks on the inside are likely to have lower levels of education, higher mental health needs, and a lot of other things that make it a challenge to find and hold on to a job. Now, on top of that, the effect of a criminal record itself means that it's more difficult to be considered for employment. And then there are studies that show that this effect is amplified for Black job seekers, so that having a criminal record actually has more of a negative effect on Black job seekers than on white job seekers. And finally, people with criminal records might be prevented from obtaining certain occupational licenses. So you might be prevented statutorily from accessing employment that you were otherwise qualified for or that you had participated in the past. Throughout the presentation, you're going to see links that bring you to some of the one-pagers or fact sheets that the Justice Center has created on these topics. So we've used the term collateral consequences, and these are legal barriers that apply because of a criminal record. They vary based on your offense level, but they can impact employment, licensing, housing, education, voting, all sorts of civil rights that we, civic rights that we participate in are impacted because of one's criminal record. Some of those are discretionary, meaning that a licensing board is able to deny you the ability to get a hairdresser license because of a misdemeanor, and some of them are mandatory, permanent, lifetime disqualifications. If you have a felony, you cannot get this license. You cannot participate in this type of employment. You can find at the ABA, I apologize, there's a typo in that, it's the ABA collateralconsequences.org website. You'll be able to sort through there, and I did a sort on collateral consequences by housing, and 47,979 different statutes were returned. Now, a lot of these were kind of tangentially related to housing. It was more you wouldn't be able to live in a community care facility. You wouldn't be able to live in a house that provides in-home daycare with certain criminal records, or a background check had to be done. But there are a lot of statutes out there that prohibit people with certain convictions from living in certain places. Most of us know, obviously, that there are frequently restrictions on where registered sex offenders can live with respect to schools and daycares and so forth. So not merely not living in an in-home daycare, but not living near one. So this slide is to really think about moving from reentry to a broader understanding of who has a criminal record. So we've been talking about folks being released from the cell to the street. So we're talking about that immediate reentry period when someone's really trying to get their feet under them and trying to stabilize. But down the line, there are about 30% of the U.S. population that has a criminal record. Now this runs the gamut from someone who has an arrest that did not lead to a conviction to someone who served time in prison for a felony conviction. But about 30% of the population is some way impacted. Now that's huge, and that means it touches all of our communities. But what we see on the left side of the slide is that it doesn't touch all of our communities equally. So the most recent numbers that were released breaking down mass incarceration in the 2010 census by race and ethnicity found that for Blacks, it's about 1 in 43 people are incarcerated, and then you can compare that to 1 in 222 whites. So when we think about this number on the left, it's a subset of the 30% on the right. And again, the numbers on the left are talking about people who are incarcerated, where the number on the right includes people who had been incarcerated as well as people who had been arrested and not incarcerated. And we actually know that disparities in arrest are even greater. So that 30%, the disparities there are even greater than what we see on the left. Now, knowing this, we also have to balance it with the fact that landlords are increasingly requiring background checks on applicants for rentals. The Fair Credit Reporting Act governs commercially prepared background checks. So those are the background checks that most landlords are going to require somebody who's applying for a rental to provide. And the Fair Credit Reporting Act, it limits what can be on those background checks. So non-conviction criminal history information, arrests that don't lead to incarceration can show up for 7 years. Convictions are reported indefinitely. The Fair Credit Reporting Act requires authorization from the person for whom you're seeking a report on and notification back to that person if an adverse action is to be taken. So if a landlord gets a criminal background check and decides not to rent to someone based on that criminal background check, they need to give notice to the applicant. And the idea behind that is that the applicant then can challenge any inaccuracies. In practice, you're not given enough time, if given notice at all, to do that. The Fair Credit Reporting Act requires these commercial reporting agencies to use reasonable procedures to assure maximum possible accuracy. Fairly often, there are great inaccuracies on these background checks. In addition, landlords don't know how to interpret a lot of the information. They get this background check and they don't know what it means. You see a code or you see a number and you have no idea how to interpret it. Landlords aren't provided with training to really talk about, criminal records go stale after a certain amount of time and lose predictive value. What does it mean when someone has a non-conviction arrest for a misdemeanor 5 years ago and no follow-up? So even if the record is accurate, the ability to interpret it and find meaning in it is fairly often lost. Unfortunately, the Fair Credit Reporting Act preempts states from increasing adverse action notifications or restricting what information can be on there. Some states currently have laws on the books that are more restrictive, saying that a commercial reporting agency cannot report convictions that are 7 years old or older, but no states can go in and make that now. So fair housing law, it prohibits discrimination, and that's been interpreted to mean both disparate treatment and disparate impact. And disparate treatment is intentional discrimination, so it is making a housing decision based on race, color, religion, sex, family status, national origin, or one's ability or disability. And as you can tell, having a criminal record is not one of those protected categories. However, because of the effect of a practice that might be fair but discriminatory in its operation, there's a protection against disparate impact. So if we think back to the slide where we looked at the differential rates in incarceration, then we know that if a housing provider has a policy or practice of not ever renting to anyone with a criminal record, no matter how old, no matter how minor, what they're going to do is disqualify larger populations of Black and Latino applicants from being able to find housing. And that is disparate impact. So, you're not treating people differently based on one of those protected categories, because criminal records aren't a protected category, but the effect of that actually is to exclude more protected groups. It's to exclude people because they fall within the group of Black and Latino rental seekers. Now, that's not to say landlords can't use criminal records when making rental decisions. They can. It has to be rationally related. So HUD recently released a guidance for public housing agencies and owners of federally assisted housing on using arrest records in housing decisions, and a really interesting and helpful guidance of that summary was available as well. So the links there will help you learn more about this and how landlords and folks are to be using kind of criminal history when making housing determinations. Now, on top of that, some cities are doing some interesting things to support housing for people with criminal records. If we think back to the first presenter, that cycle, that homelessness leads to, criminal offenses, which leads to homelessness. And so how can we break that cycle? If we know that having a stable place to live helps someone reduce their risk of recidivating, then it does us all good. It supports our communities to ensure that there's stable housing for folks. So in New Orleans, they eliminated a ban on providing housing assistance to people with criminal records and created individual review of criminal histories. And this gives someone an opportunity to be considered based on who they are, not merely their record. So it does allow for folks to make sure that they're maintaining safe spaces and safe communities while giving increased opportunities for folks with criminal records. Seattle is doing the same thing. So in this year, the mayor created the Fair Chance Housing Coalition following recommendations for a process that happened in 2015, the Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda. So they're looking to see how they can increase opportunities for folks with criminal records to ensure they have access to housing while maintaining safe communities. At the same time, some of the low-income housing agencies in that city have created these individualized assessment policies so that folks are not automatically blocked based on their criminal record, but are instead given an opportunity to explain their past, provide information on their rehabilitation and other steps they've taken to show that they could be a safe neighbor to folks. And it's, again, it's this idea that given an opportunity to explain that you're not who you were in your worst moment will allow for folks to be able to access housing and start rebuilding their community and their lives and their families. Thanks so much, Jamie.
All right, thank you, Madeline. We'll turn it over to Alex.
Okay, hello everybody. I am Alex McLaren. I am the administrator of the Female Offender Branch in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I am a licensed psychologist and also a career law enforcement officer. The Female Offender Branch, just by way of clarity, started out as the office that oversaw our 14,000 woman female population, but it has grown, so even though it's still called the Female Offender Branch, my office actually works on all of the issues that affect all of our different vulnerable populations throughout the federal system. Today, I am just going to talk through different kinds of correctional systems, I guess terms and differences, and what I hope is most useful to community-based providers, with the mindset being that we can take all the great information that has been provided so far and with the sort of know-how of what the system looks like and how it works, maybe better apply it. I'd like to start with some basic correctional information and definitions. So I work for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The Bureau of Prisons is the federal prison system. It happens to be the largest correctional system in the United States. We have 122 facilities, 28 of which house women, and they are located nationwide. They're all around the country, not necessarily in every state. But I think it's really important to understand that states have their own systems too. In fact, the Bureau of Prisons is only one of over 3,000 systems in the United States. Some of these are very big, such as some of the larger state systems, which have multiple institutions, or the federal system, and some are very small. They are a local system that involves like one county jail. But what is key there is that there is no single authority that is governing all of corrections. There are certainly common themes and practices, but the systems do differ both in what they are trying to accomplish and in how they are governed and in who sets the rules. Not to belabor the definitional piece, but let's talk a little bit about the types of facilities. You can see at the bottom of the slide, I note that there are juvenile sites. I just wanted to highlight this as a reminder that when we're talking about people that are coming out of the criminal justice system, we are talking about more than just adults. But the big thing I wanted to differentiate here on this slide is the difference between a prison and a jail. I feel like certainly in the media and just in popular, I don't know, television shows, movies, things like that, those terms are used interchangeably, and those kinds of facilities really are not the same. The Bureau of Prisons happens to have both types of facilities, but in a state system, you will generally see only prisons, and in a county or local system, you will generally see only jails. Prisons generally are part of larger systems, so there will be multiple. They are places where people go when they are sentenced. So someone who has been convicted of an offense and been sentenced to some type of term of incarceration. These are often located in more rural areas, and that means that they are potentially farther from family connections, homes, and even resources. Jails are sometimes known as lockups. These are generally pretrial facilities, although they can also be facilities where people would serve a term of incarceration if it is very short, certainly less than 1 year, and generally significantly less, something like months or even days. They tend to have fewer staff, particularly fewer non-custody staff, and they are often in urban areas, so they are either in the county seat or in the city where a person was arrested, so they're closer to courthouses and places where people are going to get their legal issues addressed. So we understand what the facilities are. I wanted to talk about what kinds of services people get there. I suppose if there's one common theme to what I'm going to say today, it is that no one size fits all. So a city jail that is, I don't know, holding people on bond hearings is certainly going to have different levels, intensity of services than a high security prison where people are serving significantly lengthy sentences. So while the intensity and the availability of services will vary across sites, nearly all places will have the basics of medical and mental health care available, because those are not something that can be held off on. Those are something that have to be available, and so those are generally required by law. But the level of availability of those services and the type is, again, going to vary. So at a jail or a short-term type of facility, the sorts of mental health and medical services that a person would get are going to be of the crisis variety, versus somebody in a prison where, I mean, we have entire units for people receiving dialysis. We have inpatient substance abuse and psychiatric treatment units. So it's a very different kind of a setup. At some of the longer-term facilities, you will also see very impressive vocational training, sometimes certifications that are Department of Labor recognized and are viable outside of the prison environment, in the federal prison system and in many state systems as well. We have like our own prison industries where people are able to work and even get bonding to obtain similar jobs in the community. You will have education from special education and GED, English as a second language, to college and higher level courses. And of course you will have more individualized services based on somebody's needs. In the Bureau of Prisons, we also have very broad parenting programs. We have a number of gender responsive programs that are designed specifically for women. We have LGBT support groups, a whole variety of services, and I think you'll see that in many of the larger systems. So where does reentry planning fit into this picture? In the Bureau of Prisons, we believe that reentry begins on the first day. So as soon as someone is arrested, we're already looking at okay, what comes next? What's going to happen when we're not in a correctional environment anymore? I'd like to use BOP as the example just as because that is something I can speak to, that is where I work, and let you know kind of how our reentry planning process works. In the Bureau of Prisons, once you are sentenced, and certainly when you are still pretrial as well, you will go through some of these same procedures. But once you are sentenced and or arrive at the facility where you're going to be, there's an initial screening that takes place by both security and case management staff, as well as by medical and mental health staff, just to take care of urgent needs. And then the individual is assigned to a multidisciplinary team for a more in-depth assessment of criminogenic and reentry needs. This information is used to develop a plan for programming, the idea being that for many of the needs that a person had that were not being addressed while they were in the community prior to incarceration, there's a lot that can be done to address those things while the person is serving their term of incarceration, instead of just waiting for them to get out and do those things when they leave, whether that's trauma treatment or job training or whatever the case may be. As the release date approaches, there will be a greater focus on concrete plans for reintegration, and this will absolutely include a housing plan. So, when I say a housing plan, please think about what I said about type of facility. Somebody who has done 5 years is probably going to have an adequate amount of time to make a viable housing plan. Somebody who was in a lockup over a long weekend and was transient before that is not going to have that same time available, even if the staff were available to work on those sorts of housing plans. And someone that did 20 years had all the time in the world, but a lot of the connections and resources that that person once had may have sort of drifted away over the time that the person has been out of the community. Regardless of what the plan is, a person does need to be freed at some point when a sentence expires. So even when great efforts are expended towards the development of a housing plan, there's only so much that can be done. When it's time for them to go, they do need to go. Some people may also have special needs that will impact the location of appropriate resources for their housing plan. I can even use women as an example. You know, women in the federal system make up about 7% of our population, and for many women in prison, prison is safer than the place that they were before they came to prison, so safety needs to be a major concern, and depending on whether that woman has children, it may need to be some kind of an environment that will allow her to live safely with those children. You could think of somebody who was previously married, and while they've been incarcerated, that marriage has disintegrated, so they're not returning to that and are unsure where to go. You could think of a juvenile with abusive parents that maybe the housing plan sounds good, but in reality there are some other factors that become identified later. There are just a million scenarios. And unfortunately I have to note, and I'm sure you all know this, that even with the perfect plan, sometimes things come up that are unexpected and it falls through. I thought it made sense to review some of the different options for housing, and I'd like to note here that for correctional systems, there are generally minimal or non-existent funds to cover things that take place after release. So even in a halfway house, this is usually partially funded for the individual, but that will generally be the end of it. Systems are generally appropriated to use their funds for operating, and so they can't just pull from those budgets and give that money to individuals going out to, say, make a deposit on a rental property. If someone is doing a lengthy sentence in a prison-type facility, they certainly have the opportunity to have a job there and earn money that they could save up to put towards some kind of housing plan. But at least as it stands at present, it's not generally an option for funds to be diverted from kind of one cost center or budget to another to help with that sort of thing. Anyway, so starting with halfway houses, in the federal system we call them residential reentry centers. Generally, halfway houses or RRCs are either run by the government or they are contracted to be run by an outside party, but for the government, for the state system. And as I mentioned, they are not necessarily free. There is usually some emphasis on the individual that will be residing there taking some level of financial responsibility, although there are generally allowances for people who are indigent. Not everybody coming out of a correctional facility will go to a halfway house. First of all, you generally only go to those when you've served a sentence, so you're coming out of prison. Usually that's not an option for people coming out of jail. Additionally, there are people who don't want to go to those or who for a variety of other reasons, sometimes because their needs are so significant, unfortunately, do not qualify for those kinds of facilities. A second and related type of housing option is sort of other transitional housing is what I called it on the slide, but what I meant are more of these private halfway houses that generally require an individual to be aware that they exist so they can apply to them. They often have a special kind of a focus, like a substance use recovery property or a female victim of domestic violence property. Some of them are faith-based in nature. Some people actually have a home to go to, whether that is owning or renting. Something I want to note here that was pointed out by one of the previous presenters is for certain kinds of subsidized properties, there are limits, so people that are coming out of prison may not be allowed to live in those properties, even if, in fact, their family is residing there, which can present a challenge. Some people will have a commitment from family or friends to live with them, but as we all know, that can change rapidly, either because that person's circumstances change or because the person gets out and it doesn't go as well as was hoped for. And then kind of on the lesser desirable options, you have short-term and day type of shelters, which is generally not something that someone's going to choose to put in a release plan. But like I mentioned, at some point you do have to release people, and that may be the only option. And then, of course, you're left with homelessness. Efforts are made to connect people with special supportive services based on their needs. An example would be someone who has a disability or who needs child care or family-friendly housing. But the reality is, depending on where they're going, those resources are not always available. I think it's also important to note kind of at this point that benefit recovery would ideally be part of the reentry process, but it might not always happen. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Corrections systems are almost always understaffed and under-resourced and could always use more funds to help with the reentry planning process. So, you know, just starting there, not every type of system and facility is going to have someone that's qualified to assist with those kinds of services. But even in a system like the federal system where we have social workers, there are all kinds of benefits. There are federal benefits as well as things that might come. Maybe somebody worked for a company in the past and is entitled to some sort of pension. So no one person is going to be knowledgeable about all of those different types of benefits. Some you can start the process in prison, but you still have to present in person or actually prove that you've gotten out to get the benefit restarted. There's online applications. There is lack of documentation available in prison. And then there is, of course, in the shorter stay facilities, probably just a lack of time to plan for those things. So what are the solutions? Because I don't want to kind of start wrapping this up on a negative note. And I think the point that I'd like to make with this slide is that correctional workers and those that provide services to individuals that have come out of correctional facilities often have many of the same goals. And I really think when this isn't recognized, it leads to a lot of miscommunications and missed opportunities. People that go and work in corrections want exactly the same things. They want to see quality services. They want to see the services that they were providing to this individual while they were incarcerated continue in the community. They just may not always know how to make that occur. We all want to see the reduction of recidivism. We want to see people go to a home and not wind up homeless. And we want to make sure that services are available and accessible, and we will pound the pavement to find those things. So what can we do to sort of in terms of future directions? This is just kind of my wrap up, I guess. How can we collaborate and try to keep as many people as possible from homelessness, and even if they do wind up homeless, make sure that they are getting services as quickly as possible. The biggest thing is to communicate. This webinar is a really good start, just people being here and listening. I really can't say strongly enough that you should get to know your corrections systems, whether that be depending on the scope of the services that you provide or that those in your coalition provide. If it's a jail that's in your county, if it is a juvenile detention facility, if there is a federal facility that's located in your state or that individuals who live in your area might go to, get to know them. All of our federal facilities have a reentry affairs coordinator, and many state facilities and even smaller local facilities have some kind of person whose role is exactly that, to kind of network with community providers and help to bridge that gap so people don't sort of fall through the cracks when they first come out and miss out on services that are needed. You can also, if you do have that relationship, the people at the facility will realize when there's somebody who's at risk coming out, and they may be willing to reach out to you ahead of time so you can get a plan in place and maybe even get to know these individuals. At least in our system and probably in many, nothing stops a provider from coming and meeting the individual before they get out, from participating in reentry fairs and job fairs and other sorts of transitional services. The other suggestion I have is to make sure that information about any services that you provide are widely available. And by widely available, I mean easy to read, in multiple languages if possible, and accessible on places other than the internet. You know, we see people in prison who have been down for a very long time, and they may not know how to use the internet or feel comfortable with technology. And so the more that things are available in simpler forms with phone numbers and maybe old style forms of communication, that can be very helpful. And just the final thing is to remember that corrections really does care. Sometimes just due to budgetary constraints, we are limited in our reach, and we are limited from following people after they leave the system, but it doesn't mean that we don't care what happens to them, and we will always partner with other providers whenever that's possible. Thank you very much for listening today, and I will turn it back over to Jamie now.
Thank you so much, Alex. And now I'm going to turn it over to Craig and Marcus. Hi, just make sure you're off mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. Good afternoon, I'm Marcus DeWall. I'm the Deputy Chief with the Alameda County Probation Department in Oakland, California. I'm going to talk briefly about the difference between probation and parole, and then I'm going to turn it over to Craig Emmons, one of our division directors, and then Wendy Jackson, who works at one of our homeless service providers called East Oakland Community Project. Briefly, what I want to say, the difference between probation and parole, well, a similarity first is that they're both alternatives to incarceration. However, the difference is probation occurs prior to the imposition of a jail or prison sentence. Conversely, parole is an early release from prison. Now, here in California, with realignment that was enacted in 2011, the probation departments in California do now supervise a portion of the population that gets released from state prison. This population is offenders that have been convicted and have served time for a nonviolent or non-serious offense. So now we have this additional population that we're supervising in addition to the felons who are placed on formal probation in the county. So with that, there was opportunities and challenges, opportunities to serve an additional population, but the challenges were we had to put together an infrastructure to meet some of the risks and the needs that have already been discussed during the presentation. And so that's what we're going to delve into towards the end of the presentation. I am going to turn it over to Craig right now so that he can talk a little bit about what we do from the probation perspective, beginning with investigations through our continuum of supervision.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll use our short slideshow here to give an overview of what we do in probation, but I really like to spend the meat of our time talking about what we're here for, the homelessness and the reentry population. I'll talk a little bit about our program that we use for housing, and then turn it over to Wendy Jackson to talk about the work they do with our clients and some obstacles that they've seen in the time that they've been doing the work. So our first slide is about adult investigations. This is our starting point in the for adult services. This is where we become involved. It's once a person has received a conviction and the court refers the matter to probation for a pre-sentence report. And you can see from this slide last year the number of pre-sentence reports that we completed and the number of risk assessments that we completed on the clients where we did a report. Next slide, please. Jamie? Oh, you did. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm sorry. There was a delay on my side. I apologize. In this slide,
across the country.
In this slide, you can see the risk assessment tool that we currently use and how it's broken down. It differentiates clients from high, which is a score of 25 or above, medium, which is 21 to 24, and 20 or below are services as needed. And this is the tool that we currently use to identify the clients and how they'll receive services. So the high-risk clients are assigned to a DPO, and they will traditionally check in with that DPO at least monthly. I'm sorry, Deputy Probation Officer. When I say DPO, I mean Deputy Probation Officer. Clients that score as medium will be assigned to our kiosk where they report electronically, and there is a probation officer assigned to that position, but reporting electronically, you may have a caseload of 200 to one probation officer. And in total, we have about 600 clients currently on kiosk. Next slide, please. This slide depicts our low-risk clients that are on a services as needed caseload. We have approximately 5,000 clients that are on services as needed caseload, and this is evidence-based that the clients that are on the services as needed, they'll go to an orientation. We'll do an explanation of the expectations for them, how to get a hold of a probation officer if they need services, and the evidence-based practices shows that with this population that are assessed as low, that they have the ability to self-correct, right? The more you intermix this population and the more intervention you have, it actually tends to, you tend to get worse outcomes. Next slide, please. So the next two slides will give you an example of some of the work that our staff do. So in domestic violence, we have probation officers that have clients that have been convicted of a domestic violence offense, and the probation officers work with them to make sure that they get treatment. Here in California, it's a 52-week treatment. Next slide, please. This is another example, the sex offender unit that of the services that we provide. We have probation officers that have clients that have been convicted of a sex offense, and they work with local law enforcement, the treatment providers, and the clients to make sure that they get the appropriate treatment and to monitor them in the hopes that they do not reoffend. Next slide, please. So Marcus made mention of Assembly Bill 109 that started in October 2011, and this gave us a new client, a client that previously had been supervised by the state at parole, and now these low-level felony offenders, what we refer to as non, so non-serious, non-violent, and low-level sexual offenders, now instead of coming back into the community on parole, the responsibility for supervising this population starting in October 2011 was given to the county's probation departments. And then in turn, I should also say, besides those clients that are coming from prison, we also have clients that in lieu of being sentenced to go to state prison are doing their time in what we call local prison, so here in our jails, and then when they're released, their supervision would also be a responsibility of the county probation departments. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is the end of our slide presentation, but there were some questions that were posed that that I wanted to take some time to answer about what we do, what are our roles and responsibilities. And besides the items that you've seen in our PowerPoint presentation, the court officers, we write court reports, to make appropriate dispositions for clients that have been convicted of a felony offense. So you saw that on the investigation slide. For supervision, a big responsibility for the assigned probation officer is to identify the client's needs and then make appropriate referrals to services. When the clients are in those services, they monitor the client's progress, report that progress to the court, conduct address verifications, and then probation compliance searches at the client's homes. Another question that was posed to me, getting into the homeless population for reentry, can clients reside in shelters while they're on probation and parole? And the answer to this question is yes. We currently have clients that do not have housing and reside in shelters until we can find them stable housing. Marcus made reference to it earlier, but I'll go into greater detail that here in Alameda County we have, for our clients, we have a housing program, and Wendy will discuss the housing program, but that's something that's been a real help in stabilizing our clients. Another question that was asked was, what happens if someone violates their probation or parole? And to that I say, it depends on the client's situation and the nature of the violation. In Alameda County, we use sanctions that are appropriate for the negative behavior, and this is an evidence-based practice. So the negative behaviors need to be addressed, but that doesn't mean that the client necessarily is going to be revoked and sent back to custody. So the response to the violation or the negative behavior should be should meet the level of the violation. So if it's something small, then the response should be small. And we use things here. The client may have to write a letter. The client may have increased reporting. For the PRCS population, there's the use of flash incarceration. So the point that I want to get across here is that for every violation, for every negative behavior, it doesn't mean that the client is going to go back into custody. And on the other side of the coin, we also believe in rewarding the client when they do something well. So if they make positive progress in their treatment goals and their case plan, we can reward that with a gift card, say for a sandwich, or decreased reporting, or even for long-term positive behavior, we can decrease their time of supervision. Another question that I was asked were some of the common myths about probation. And this is something that I like to talk about on a regular basis. So something that I hear in the community and I hear from the clients are, oh, if I have a violation, I'm automatically going back to jail. We hear that from providers a lot, that they don't like to give us full information on clients, especially when they've had you know, something negative happen in their lives, because they feel like the clients are going to be locked up. And we've moved away from the lock them up mentality. We know that doesn't work. It's been tried, and what's happened is, you know, we in California that we have overcrowding in our prisons, and it isn't effective in rehabilitation. So here we work with our clients. We respond to violations, as I said before, with incentives and sanctions that meet the negative behavior. We don't automatically lock the clients up and file a revocation. And what's interesting is I see that works with the clients. I've had many a client come up to me and we're surprised that their assigned probation officer didn't file a violation or lock them up for a positive urine test. And what I've noticed is that when the clients see that the probation officer is willing to work with them, and that when they fall down or make mistakes that they're not going to be locked up, that gives the clients a trust in the probation officer and a sense of confidence. And I've seen a lot of success with moving away from the lock 'em up mentality. The last question that was posed to me for today's webinar was about case managers and homeless providers and how they could work with probation or parole. And that to me is a good question for Wendy Jackson. As we said, Wendy Works is one of the programs that we work with here in Alameda County to provide our clients with housing. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Wendy, who is the Executive Director of the East Oakland Community Project.
Hello, everyone. I am Wendy Jackson, and our program at the East Oakland Community Project started, I believe, in 2012. We are able to provide services as a result of a collaboration between the Department of Probation, the Alameda County Housing and Community Development Department, and also the Social Services Agency. So all of the clients who come to us from probation come to our housing specialist through a referral by their deputy probation officer. And just to give you an idea of how many people we're serving, in the fiscal year July to June 2015 to 2016, we served 218 clients. Of those clients, we're able to house approximately 36% and permanently house. Others have gone to temporary situations But I just want to back up a little bit and talk about how that referral works. So the deputy probation officer refers a client to us. It usually happens by phone call and or email, and we then set out to contact the client ourselves and bring them in. If the client is actually homeless, doesn't have anywhere to go, we make a place for that person in our shelter, whether it's a male or a female. We can bring someone in immediately. If the client is has a way of staying with a relative or a friend, and it seems through discussion to be a safe alternative, we can help that relative or friend with additional expenses through gift cards and that sort of thing to just bolster their situation a bit so that the client can stay there as we work with them on a permanent housing solution. I think that what we're finding in our community is that many of our clients, they don't have, of course, the means, and also don't always have the desire to live on their own immediately, but it's mostly about means. We are a very, very high-priced market. I believe that Ms. Owens spoke about, you know, how much money it takes to rent a unit. Oakland somehow became the third largest, highest rated rental market in the country. That's like ridiculous, behind New York and San Francisco. And it's just crazy because it's not New York or San Francisco, but it's still a fact. And so what we have been able to find for our clients are community living spaces that often are run by churches or groups that offer a bed in a room, usually with a couple of roommates, and for a lot of our clients that works at least temporarily. So you could get a person who's actually homeless and needs a place. They might come into our shelter. We introduce them to one of these providers, and then we're able to place them there as they look for work on their substance abuse issues, and constantly coming in to meet with our housing specialists to get the services that they need. This is sometimes, as you can imagine, that client that has the most work history is often going to get find a job, and then a permanent housing solution can come a lot sooner. But of course, many of our clients are people who have not been able to develop a long-standing work history or skill, and so these things are problematic, as you might guess. What we are finding that, of course, the number one need of clients referred to us by the Department of Probation is the need for income and or employment and housing. And so through the various RFPs and grant opportunities that have been put out, our county has worked with as many as 4 providers at a time for employment. That has been difficult to get people there. I think the latest iteration of this employment services contract is down to one contract, and that entity will subcontract to others. And I think that will streamline the process and help more of our people to get the employment services that they need. What we found, it's not just getting a job, it's helping clients to with their job retention skills, you know, getting there on time, how to work out a problem on the job, how to save their money. Those are the things that are really, really needed by our clients, and we help with that. And we know that the best employment services providers are also helping with that, but they need much more. What are our housing specialists doing? Our program had previously been run with, operated with 2 housing specialists. They have large caseloads, and as you probably can imagine, and it's true in your communities, that the deputy probation officers also have very large caseloads. So I've heard all the speakers prior talk about the need for communication, and one of our biggest needs that we've experienced in this community is the need to communicate as often as possible between our programs, i.e. our housing specialists and the deputy probation officers. Sometimes that happens on an individual basis a lot. Sometimes it's difficult because everyone has such a large caseload. What we are moving toward, and I'm hoping sooner rather than later, is some kind of twice monthly or monthly case conference, because that would really help us to zero in on the needs of every client and get them the services that they need as fast as possible, to also build a picture of what they need to ultimately not violate their probation and not face reincarceration. So what are our housing specialists doing with clients? They provide support. They find places. They negotiate issues with property owners and managers and programs that our clients might go into. They provide a lot of emotional support, because that's what clients need. They need someone who can truly express that they care, show it by their deeds, and actually congratulate and support our clients when they when good things have happened, and be there when things aren't happening very well. The money that the program brings to house clients quickly and effectively has really made a big difference. Our organization is in its 26th year, and so we've always served people who are on parole or who have been released from prison and did all of their time and are not on parole. But this helps us to help people get housed much more quickly, and I think that it's made a big difference in how many people get housed, how well people can then begin to adjust into the community. We provide transportation, we provide IDs, we provide many of the things that help them get on their way to the next thing. As some of you have probably found, when we're working with clients on probation, it's very hard, especially it's very hard for women. In fact, finding housing for women, finding employment, all those things seem to be more difficult. We get, of course, many fewer women, but when we do get women, there are just a lot of challenges. As you know, when people are incarcerated, women get the least amount of visitors and all of that. Well, the same thing when they come out, there's just not a lot of support available. So our housing specialists are there to give them support, to complement whatever services they're getting from the Department of Probation. We have set up the Department of Probation has set up a transitional day reporting center that offers support to clients on probation, and it's been really good because a lot of the ongoing services that clients need are housed there, and particularly like job retention skills and those things. They are getting a lot of that from that center, and it provides a place that they can always go to get support. So we see that as a big bump up in supportive services for people on probation. Our biggest need, as I said, at this time is to have an ongoing vehicle for communicating about specific clients, and as I said, we are working hard to increase communication by having that. I'm calling it a case conference. It can be called something else, but that's what we need in our community, and I think you can't over-communicate about the need of someone to have a life that feels like it's been restarted in the positive, and the more people that come to that assistance with a strategic plan, the better served all of our clients and realignment will be. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wendy, and to Marcus and Craig. So we have a lot of questions, and we have a little less than 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try and do a little bit of an overview of these questions. One, let me direct it to Marcus and Craig. Someone's been asking about your risk assessment tools and the assessments that you use. Are those county-specific, or are those something that are used across the country?
Yeah, so the risk assessment tool that we're using was actually a tool that was created internally. We have a new chief probation officer that just started about a month and a half ago. Her name's Wendy Still. So we're in the process actually of changing our risk and needs assessment tool to a tool that's been validated on a similar population to Alameda County. That's one of the challenges that we have faced here, is that we were using an in-house tool, yet it wasn't a validated tool. So that's a big issue that we've needed to address, and it's really the foundation of what we do and what we're going to do with supervision. So it's not, to answer the question, it's an internal tool. It's not a tool used across the nation. We were looking at using a validated tool before the new chief came on board, but we've put a pause on it for now until she and I have some agreement on what we're going to do moving forward with using a validated instrument.
Okay, great. And one quick follow-up. It sounds like you have a great partnership with Wendy and her organization in terms of housing. What would happen if someone didn't have shelter to go to, if there was no more room in the shelter? How does probation and parole work for that?
So go ahead, Wendy.
If we cannot find a place for the person to stay, i.e. we have no room in the shelter, as a next resort, we can put that person in a motel. We have a how do you say, a contract with a good, clean motel where people can stay, and that's like the, a last resort. Usually we aren't so filled that we cannot make an accommodation. It may not be a perfect one, like a bed in a regular dorm, but we try our best to accommodate. But when there's absolutely no room, that's what we go to.
Okay. And are people allowed to be on parole and probation if they don't have shelter?
Yes, they are. We actually have a big population of clients that are on probation that are transient. We have found that sometimes that's, it's a cat and mouse game, and part of what we try to employ is through motivational interviewing and having a relational type of supervision, is over time we can break down those barriers with the clients to where they are open to us encouraging them to be in housing, definitely with certain clients that have certain conditions of probation, such as the registered sex offenders. If they are transient, then it may get to the point where we have to go back to court and request that they be put on GPS monitoring. That's just so that we have some checks and balances in place. But it's not a requirement that everybody has to be housed. We do make it a high priority to get the clients housed, and the program that we've put together in 2012 that includes Wendy's program and 3 other providers when we initially started is really a concerted effort by the county, including the Board of Supervisors, to put people in housing, because we really do feel that having a stable housing environment will reduce recidivism.
Okay, great. And this may be a question for Alex or others on the panel. What are some veteran reentry service programs? Does the Bureau of Prisons or others work with VA programs?
The Bureau of Prisons does work with the VA. There are usually fairly robust services for people that were veterans. And so if the person lets us know, usually we have that information even at the time that they come into the system, we can connect them. We have even had VA folks come and do stuff with our inmates while they're still in custody. So that's actually a fairly, I mean, the VA has good resources, and they've been really great partners.
I can add one thing. I'd like to add just one thing to that. If we get a veteran through the Department of Probation at our organization, I suspect this is true for many organizations around the country, what we bring in the person through reentry and then and they're usually, in most cases, eligible for one of the other veteran programs that we have, and one of them would be the Supportive Services for Veteran Families program or our regular VA Emergency Shelter program. And so that's as was said, as Alex said, pretty robust services. They can be, their needs can be addressed immediately and with full force.
Okay, great. Let's see. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm just going to try and filter out a few. Does anyone, and maybe this is a question again for Marcus and Craig and Wendy, are you working with the Public Housing Authority? Is that part of your programming?
Yes, it depends on, we do, I think, I don't know if the Department of Probation has separate programs, but through some of our other programs, the Oakland Housing Authority can provide units. It's a more lengthy process. Usually the person has to qualify for Shelter Plus Care, which very often they do, and that's a path to permanent housing and permanent housing that comes with services and financial support. I don't know if the Department of Probation has a separate contracts with OHA. Maybe Marcus knows that.
Yeah, we do not have a separate contract with the Housing Authority. The program that we put together is run by the Community Development Agency. That's who we actually have our MOU with, and that's who receives the allocation through our county from the Board of Supervisors, and then they contract with providers like East Oakland Community Project. And so that type of communication and those any additional funding or opportunities really is handled on that side, the other side of the MOU. We're really basically funneling the referrals to them so that they can get the housing through the contracted providers. So those conversations may be taking place, but they're not being initiated by the probation department.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're just out of time, so I just want to take a moment to thank our speakers. This was a great webinar, lots of great information. We will be sending, posting, excuse me, a recording of this webinar, both on the endhomelessness.org website as well as our coalition website, which is reentryandhousing.org, and we'll try to find a way to answer a lot of these other questions that have come up. So thank you, everyone, and have a pleasant rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.